A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Most people think of Switzerland and they picture the Alps, maybe some high-end watches, or a very specific type of bank account that usually ends up as a plot point in a spy movie. But there is a much more interesting, almost invisible infrastructure that the Swiss have built over the last century and a half. It is this idea of the armed neutral, a country that stays out of the fight specifically, so it can be the one person everyone is still willing to talk to when the shooting starts. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the mechanics behind Switzerland's protecting power mandates and the strategic architecture of their neutrality, a world that feels like it is splitting into very hard blocks again. It is March 21st, 2026, and the concept of a neutral ground has never felt more fragile or more necessary.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, Daniel really hit on a topic that is far more technical and operational than the general public realizes. When we talk about Swiss neutrality, we are not just talking about a passive refusal to take sides. It is a highly active, resource-intensive diplomatic product. They have essentially productized trust. In international law, specifically under the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, there is this mechanism called a protecting power mandate. It is what happens when two countries break off diplomatic relations entirely. They close their embassies, they expel the staff, but they still have citizens living in each other's territory, and they still need a way to pass messages without accidentally starting a nuclear war.
It is the ultimate ghost protocol. But you mentioned something that I think is the core of the paradox here. You called it a diplomatic product. That makes it sound like a service-level agreement, which is a very different vibe than the lofty humanitarian peace broker image the Swiss government usually puts forward. If I am a superpower like the United States, or even a country that the rest of the world is treating as a pariah, why am I trusting a small Alpine nation with my most sensitive consular secrets? What is the actual value proposition they are offering that, say, a digital encrypted channel wouldn't solve?
The value is the physical presence and the institutional memory. A digital channel can be hacked, spoofed, or simply shut down. But a Swiss diplomat sitting in an interest section in Tehran or Havana provides a physical point of contact that is governed by strict legal protocols. Think about the logistical nightmare when the United States and Iran severed ties in 1980. You still have thousands of people with dual citizenship, you have legal disputes, you have prisoners. The Swiss stepped in and said, "We will act as the legal proxy for the United States in Iran." That means there is a physical building, often the old embassy or a dedicated wing of the Swiss embassy where the Swiss flag flies, but inside they are performing the duties of the American government. They are processing passports, visiting Americans in prison, and acting as a literal mailbox for diplomatic notes.
So, when a Swiss diplomat visits a prisoner in a place where the United States has no presence, are they acting as a neutral observer, or are they literally wearing the hat of an American consular officer for that hour? Because that seems like a very thin line to walk. If you are too helpful to the Americans, the Iranians get suspicious. If you are too cozy with the host government, the Americans think you are compromised. How do they actually maintain that firewall?
It is entirely about operational silos within the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs or the FDFA. They have developed these internal protocols where the teams handling a specific mandate are walled off from the rest of the diplomatic corps. When a Swiss official walks into a prison in Tehran to check on an American citizen, they are acting under the legal authority of the protecting power mandate. They are not there to negotiate a trade deal for Swiss cheese. They have a very specific checklist dictated by international law and the bilateral agreement between the two hostile powers. The Swiss essentially act as a transparent pipe. They do not add their own flavor to the message. They do not interpret the intent. They deliver the message exactly as written and report the facts of a consular visit exactly as observed. That lack of interpretation is actually their greatest strength.
It sounds incredibly tedious, which is probably why it works. It is the diplomatic equivalent of a blind trust. But I wonder about the competition. Because in the last few years, we have seen countries like Qatar, Oman, and even Turkey positioning themselves as the new go-to mediators. They are flashy, they host the big summits, and they seem to have a more transactional, fast-paced approach to diplomacy. Is Switzerland losing its status as the gold standard of neutrality, or is there a difference between what Qatar does and what the Swiss do?
There is a massive difference, and it comes down to the distinction between mediation and acting as a protecting power. Qatar and Oman are fantastic at mediation. They are great at getting people into a room at a luxury hotel and hammering out a deal. But that is often personality driven and transactional. It depends on the current emir or the current political climate. Switzerland's role as a protecting power is institutional. It is baked into their constitution and their long-term foreign policy. They currently hold about 7 to 9 of these mandates, depending on how you count the active interest sections. They have been doing the United States mandate in Iran since 1980. They did the United States mandate in Cuba for over 50 years until 2015. They have a 70-year head start on building the legal and administrative infrastructure to handle these things. Qatar might get you a ceasefire, but Switzerland will make sure your citizens can get a notary public in a war zone for 30 years straight.
So, it is the difference between a high-stakes negotiator and a world-class property manager. One is exciting and makes the news. The other just makes sure the lights stay on and the paperwork is filed correctly so the system doesn't collapse. But let's talk about the cost of that credibility. We saw this play out in 2024 and 2025 with the conflict in Ukraine. Switzerland had to make some very tough choices about sanctions. When they aligned with European Union sanctions against Russia, the Kremlin basically said, "Okay, you are no longer neutral. We don't want you as a mediator." Does that move toward a more values-based neutrality threaten the entire business model of the protecting power mandate?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question facing the Swiss Federal Council right now. There is a tension between what they call neutrality of law and neutrality of values. Historically, Switzerland has argued that they are militarily neutral, meaning they won't join a military alliance like NATO, but they are not politically or morally indifferent. However, in the current geopolitical climate, the world is becoming less tolerant of that distinction. Russia's rejection of Swiss mediation was a significant blow to the Swiss brand. It opened the door for countries like China or the United Arab Emirates to say, "Look, the Swiss have picked a side, come to us instead." But here is the thing. Even if Russia doesn't want Switzerland to host a peace summit, they still need someone to handle the basic consular functions in countries where they have broken ties. The administrative side of the protecting power mandate is much harder to replace than the hosting of a conference.
It is almost like Switzerland is trying to pivot from being the world's living room to being the world's back office. But even a back office needs to be seen as impartial. If I am a country that feels targeted by the West, and I see Switzerland adopting Western sanctions, I might worry that the Swiss diplomat visiting my citizens is sharing information with Western intelligence services. How do the Swiss prove that they aren't just a soft power extension of the Western Bloc?
They rely on the transparency of their process and the fact that they have a huge stake in their own reputation. If Switzerland were ever caught using a protecting power mandate for intelligence gathering or to favor one side, their entire foreign policy architecture would vanish overnight. It is a form of mutually assured destruction for their diplomatic status. Also, the Swiss are very careful about the legal basis of their actions. When they adopt sanctions, they frame it as upholding international law and the United Nations Charter rather than joining a political bloc. They try to find a legal hook that allows them to say, "We are still neutral, we are just being neutral in favor of the rules we all agreed on in 1945. It is a very fine needle to thread, and honestly, some days they thread it better than others.
I love the idea of being neutral in favor of the rules. It is such a lawyerly way to handle a global crisis. But let's look at the actual boots on the ground. When we talk about these interest sections, what does that actually look like? If I am an American in a country with no embassy and I walk into the Swiss embassy, am I seeing American flags? Am I talking to Americans? How does the physical space reflect this weird legal limbo?
It is usually a dedicated section of the Swiss embassy, or sometimes the original embassy building of the country that left, but it is officially part of the Swiss diplomatic mission. In Tehran, the United States interest section is physically located in the Swiss embassy. You walk in, and you are technically on Swiss sovereign ground. The staff are often local employees or Swiss diplomats, but they are trained specifically in the regulations of the country they are representing. For example, the Swiss staff in the American interest section have to be experts in United States State Department consular regulations. They are issuing documents that look and feel like American documents, but they are signed by a Swiss official acting in their capacity as the protecting power. It is a bizarre, bureaucratic nested doll situation.
You mentioned earlier that there are about 7 to 9 of these active mandates. Who are the big players right now? We know about the United States and Iran. We know about the Russia and Georgia situation that has been going on since 2009. Are there new ones popping up as the world becomes more polarized?
One of the most interesting ones recently was the mandate between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For years, the Swiss were the go-to link between those two regional heavyweights. Now, that mandate was actually terminated in 2023 because they restored direct diplomatic relations. But the fact that the Swiss kept that line open during some of the most tense years in the Middle East is a huge testament to the system. We also see Switzerland representing Iranian interests in Canada and Canadian interests in Iran. They represent the interests of Georgia in Russia and Russia in Georgia. It is this web of connections that allows for a baseline of human rights and consular protection even when the governments are practically at war.
It feels like a very analog solution in a digital age. I keep coming back to this because in 2026, we have satellite imagery, we have instant global communication, we have decentralized networks. Why is a physical building in a specific city still the gold standard? Does the digital world make the Swiss role more or less important?
I would argue it makes it more important because the digital world is so easily manipulated. In a world of deepfakes and cyber warfare, the physical presence of a third-party diplomat who can look someone in the eye and verify their identity and well-being is the only thing that cannot be easily spoofed. If the United States receives a digital message saying a prisoner is being treated well, they might not trust it. If a Swiss diplomat visits that prisoner and sends a physical report, that carries a level of weight that no encrypted email can match. Also, the protecting power mandate provides a legal shield. If you try to do this all digitally, you don't have the protection of diplomatic immunity and the specific legal frameworks of the Vienna Convention. The physical presence is what triggers the international legal protections that keep the diplomats safe while they are doing this work.
That is a fair point. The legal immunity is the real killer app here. You can't download diplomatic immunity from the cloud. But you mentioned the competition from countries like Qatar and Turkey. If those countries start offering not just mediation, but actual consular services, does Switzerland have a countermove? Or are they just going to rely on their century of experience and hope that is enough?
The Swiss countermove is what they call active neutrality. They are trying to be more proactive in offering these services before a conflict even breaks out. They are also investing heavily in the professionalization of their diplomatic corps specifically for these mandates. It is not just something a regular diplomat does on the side, it is a specialized career path. And there is a level of discretion that the Swiss provide that the newer players haven't quite mastered. Qatar and Turkey often want the public credit for their mediation. They want the photo op. The Swiss are perfectly happy to do a job for 40 years and never have anyone talk about it. For a lot of governments, that silence is the most valuable part of the package.
It is the difference between a celebrity lawyer and a quiet, high-end family office. One gets you on the news, the other keeps you out of it. But let's talk about the strategic benefit for Switzerland itself. This isn't just a charity project. Hosting these mandates gives Switzerland a level of access and influence that a country of 9 million people normally wouldn't have. They are essentially getting a front row seat to every major global conflict. How does that translate into actual national security or economic power for them?
It is the ultimate intelligence adjacent asset. By being the mailbox for the world's most hostile powers, the Swiss government has a very clear understanding of the red lines and the actual intentions of these players. They aren't reading the mail, but they are managing the flow. They know the tempo of the communication, they know the tone. That information, even if it is not used for traditional espionage, allows the Swiss to calibrate their own foreign policy with incredible precision. It makes them indispensable. If you are a major power, you can't afford to truly alienate Switzerland because you might need them to talk to your worst enemy tomorrow. That is a better defense than any tank or fighter jet could ever provide.
It is neutrality as a shield, but also as a lever. It reminds me of that old saying that if you want to be neutral, you have to be strong enough to defend that neutrality. For Switzerland, that strength isn't just their mountain forts, it is their relevance. If they stop being useful, their neutrality stops being respected.
And that is exactly why they are so obsessed with the technical details. They know that if they mess up a single consular visit, or if a single diplomatic note gets leaked, the whole house of cards could come down. We actually touched on the history of this in episode 497, where we looked at the business of neutrality. But what is different now, in 2026, is that the stakes are much higher because the global system is so much more fragile. The margin for error is smaller than it was during the Cold War.
I was thinking about the human side of this. We focus on the high-level diplomacy, but there is a Swiss diplomat somewhere right now whose entire job is helping an American citizen get a birth certificate in a country that hates America. That is a very strange way to spend your professional life. You are the middleman in a divorce where the two parties haven't spoken in 40 years, but you have to keep the kids' paperwork moving. It takes a very specific kind of temperament to do that, and not go crazy.
It requires a total suppression of ego. You have to be okay with being invisible, and that is a very Swiss trait, isn't it? There is a certain cultural alignment between the Swiss national character and this role of the impartial administrator. They aren't trying to save the world, they're trying to make sure the world's administrative gears don't grind to a halt. And in a weird way, that is how you actually save the world. You prevent the small frictions from turning into large fires.
Let's look at the future of this. If we continue toward this multipolar world where we have a Western bloc and an Eastern bloc, and maybe a global South bloc, does the role of the neutral broker become more or less viable? Because during the Cold War, there was a clear understanding of the rules. Today, it feels like the rules are being rewritten in real time. Can Switzerland survive a world where the two sides don't even agree on the basic definitions of international law?
That is the biggest threat to the Swiss model. The protecting power mandate relies on both sides agreeing to the same set of rules, specifically the Vienna Convention. If we move into a world where one side decides that the Vienna Convention no longer applies, or that they don't recognize the immunity of a Swiss diplomat acting for an enemy, then the system breaks. The Swiss are banking on the idea that even the most radical regimes still have a pragmatic need for a back channel. As long as there is a need for a way out of a crisis, there will be a need for someone like Switzerland. But they are definitely looking at their options. They are looking at how to integrate digital verification into their mandates and how to cooperate with other neutrals to create a sort of neutral network that is harder to ignore.
A neutral network. It sounds like a diplomatic version of a mesh network. If one node is compromised or rejected, the others can pick up the slack. I could see a world where Switzerland, Austria, Singapore, and maybe a few others form a formal guild of neutral service providers. They could set the standards for what impartial mediation looks like in the 21st century.
That is actually something that is being discussed in diplomatic circles. The idea of a code of conduct for neutral states. It would help them push back against the pressure to pick sides. If they can say, look, we are all following this specific code that has been vetted by the international community, it gives them a collective shield. But Switzerland is always a bit wary of joining any group, even a group of neutrals. They really value their unique status. They want to be the one and only Switzerland, not just one of several options.
It is the brand identity. They don't want to be the generic version of neutrality. They want to be the name brand. But I think for the average person listening to this, the takeaway is that neutrality is not a passive state. It is an active, expensive, and legally complex service. It is a choice that a country makes every single day, and it requires a massive amount of infrastructure to pull off. It isn't just staying home and minding your own business.
It is the exact opposite of minding your own business. It is making everyone else's business your business so that you can keep them from killing each other. It is a high wire act with no net. And the fact that they have been doing it for over 150 years is honestly one of the most impressive feats in the history of international relations. If you want to see how this works in practice, you can actually go to the website of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. They have a whole section on their active mandates. It is surprisingly transparent for such a sensitive topic.
I've actually looked at that, and it is fascinating to see the list. It is a map of the world's most broken relationships. Wherever there is a red line on the map, there is a little Swiss flag sitting right in the middle of it. It is a good reminder that even in our most polarized moments, there is still a mechanism for communication. It might be slow, it might be bureaucratic, and it might involve a lot of Swiss paperwork, but it is there.
And that brings us to the practical takeaways for today. First, we have to stop thinking of neutrality as doing nothing. In the diplomatic world, neutrality is a resource-intensive product that requires institutional memory and a specialized workforce. Second, the protecting power mandate is the foundation of global stability when formal diplomacy fails. Without the Swiss acting as the interest section for the United States in Iran or Russia in Georgia, the risk of miscalculation and accidental escalation would be significantly higher. And third, the competition for neutrality is heating up. While countries like Qatar and Oman are great at the high-stakes mediation, Switzerland's long-term institutional approach remains the gold standard for the administrative and consular side of things.
I think there is also a lesson here about the value of being the quiet professional. In a world where everyone is shouting for attention and trying to win the news cycle, there is an incredible amount of power in being the one person who is willing to be invisible and just do the work. The Swiss have built an entire national identity around being the world's most reliable middleman, and it has served them better than any empire ever could.
It is a strategic choice to be the person that everyone needs but nobody notices. And as we move deeper into this decade, I suspect we are going to see that role become more critical, not less. The digital age hasn't replaced the need for trust. It has just made trust more expensive, and the Swiss are more than happy to keep selling it.
Well, I think we have thoroughly deconstructed the Swiss diplomatic machine today. It is a lot more than just chocolate and cuckoo clocks. It is a sophisticated global back-office operation that keeps the world from falling apart when the primary systems fail.
It really is. And I hope this gives everyone a new perspective the next time they see a Swiss flag at a diplomatic summit. It is not just a symbol of peace, it is a symbol of a very specific, very difficult job being done behind the scenes.
This has been a great dive into a topic that Daniel clearly knows is more than meets the eye. It is one of those things that sits right in the background of every news story, but rarely gets the spotlight it deserves.
I love when we get to dig into the plumbing of international relations. It is where the real interesting stuff happens.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the show running smoothly behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to explore these weird prompts in such depth.
We really couldn't do it without them. If you are enjoying the show, we would love it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find us and join the conversation.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and all the ways to subscribe to the show. We have over 1,300 episodes now, so if you like this one, there is plenty more to explore.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back next time with another prompt from Daniel.
Catch you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep